My life be like, yeah. My life be.
Oh, you're talking about yeah, that's
All right, ready? Let's get it rolling. All right, guys. I want to thank everybody for coming out. And what do you guys think about this boat?
Yeah! Oh yeah!
I mean, this is the ship right here. So, right now, Captain Ralph is almost 100% done with the boat. If you haven't seen the engine room, or if you haven't seen the sleeping quarters, go check it out. I mean, it's immaculate. It's a brand new boat. It's top of the line. This is luxury for long-range fishing. So Captain Ralph has a trip coming up this week. If not this week, it's going to get pushed maybe to next week, and then we got our trip for the slow pitch coming up on the 20th to 22nd. So I think we have about 6 spots open for that, but we have a great crew coming. We got Benny's going to be there. We got our boys from NLO. They're going to be there. I know that sounds like a 90s boy band, right? NLO? Yeah. But these guys are the pioneers in South Florida, the United States, that have brought slow pitch jigging here. They've been working the craft for years. How long you been doing it, Benny? 8, 9, 10?
About 8 years now.
About 8 years. So these guys have tried a lot of products. They continue to do prototypes and keep working on the best products out there. So these guys are the guys you want to fish with. So this trip is going to be great. Another thing to mention on our trip, since we have Big Dog Tackle there and Benny Ortiz, we have a lot of giveaways that we're going to be doing. So Hayabusa has already donated products. NLO's donating one of their brand new rods. Temple Reefs donated a Gravitate, if not one of these new ones that are coming out. So one of those two are going to be there. So we have a lot of cool things that are going to be happening on that trip. So another benefit to come hang out with us the 20th to the 22nd. And I think that's the inaugural slow pitch jigging trip in South Florida. Also, Captain Ralph, you know, besides the chef being excellent and having the best food, he's also going to be doing some long-range trips to Port Canaveral with Jeff from Slow Pitch Jigging North America. He's arranging that trip, so that's going to be a great trip. And then also there's going to be some long-range trips to the Bahamas between 3 and 10 days. Who doesn't want to hook up on a 100-pound yellowfin tuna with one of these guys? I mean, that's just sick, just to even think about that. Or even deep drop for queen snappers or yellow eyes. I mean, those are just things that, you know, most people just dream of. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Benny, and he's going to spread some of his wisdom.
All right. Well, thank you very much, folks. All right, so I am Benny Ortiz, as he said. So I've been doing this a while. I've been doing this about 8 years now. Actually, Jeff, the Stefano over there, he sold me my first jigging rod a long time ago in a parking lot by Starbucks. So I always joke with my wife that, you know, whenever we do these tackle deals, it's like you're like a drug dealer, you know, you're like you're meeting someplace with cash and yeah. Anyway, so let me tell you a little bit about myself. A lot of you guys probably know me by now. Just in general, how I got started, where I, you know, kind of a background. So I was basically a bottom fisherman. I did a lot of bottom fishing. Never really was into fishing kites or trolling, just wasn't my thing. But eventually I just kind of got tired of bottom fishing. There's only so much you can figure out in terms of keeping your sinker still and feeling for a bite. And I learned that there was this thing probably about 9-10 years ago now. It's butterfly jigging by Shimano. You know, probably everybody's heard of butterfly jigging from Shimano. That was really the first introduction to jig fishing that I had, and it was this system, and it was a great marketing campaign from them to have, you know, jigs and rods and line and everything in one package. And it was just super easy to get, and also had no idea how to do it. So I got myself my setup, and I went out there to try to jig, and I didn't catch any fish in my first 2 drops. Sorry if this wind is blowing a little bit much, but so I went back to my bait rod, and I did that pretty consistently until I went on my first jig-only trip, and then I realized, oh wait, this does work. The problem was that I was speed jigging. So speed jigging, if anyone's done it, is super taxing. It just kind of kills you as you're ripping that jig through the water column. You might have heard it's a reaction bike. Remember, it's a fleeing bait fish as it goes through the water column. You know, mostly the fish that you're getting are your jacks and some pelagics like bonitas, kingfish, things that I wasn't particularly interested in. I was more interested in the delicious stuff that was at the bottom. So to that end, started looking online, realized that there was this thing in Japan called micro jigging or slow jigging, and as Jeff can probably attest, that's when the trial and error started. So at the time, and you guys now are, you know, I hear people say now, oh, you know, it's so hard to find information. Try 7-8 years ago when the only information here is in Japanese, right? Google Translate wasn't what it is now, and still is not so great in Japanese. I had basically had a conversion for yen to dollars in my head because I was buying so much stuff from Japan. And it was really basically a very expensive game of trial and error. So we figured out, all right, well, what are these guys doing over there and why is it working? And how can we apply that to our fishery here? So, a little background on slow pitch jigging. Slow pitch jigging was started by a guy named Norihito Sato. Norihito Sato is kind of like, you know, the one over there. He's super knowledgeable. He really developed the technique to work in high pressure fisheries. Okay, so Japan, very high pressure fishery. There's no regulations with respect to size limits or catch limits really. So super high pressure, kind of like South Florida, except we have some laws here. So what were they doing? First thing you gotta do is you gotta understand the fishery over there is usually deeper water. It's usually not super hard fighting fish, usually not overstructured. So we have 3 things that is completely different than what we face here, because we face a lot of structure, a lot of big angry fish, and a lot of times you're fishing a lot shallower than what they're fishing over there. For them, shallow is, you know, 400 and under. So they're fishing out into, you know, there's fishing for skill fish in, you know, 600 meters of water. So you're looking at 2,000 feet that these guys are fishing on the bottom. So it's really specialized technique. And for that specialized technique, they developed specialized tackle. So they basically went down to the most essential questions that you could have. And if anybody knows anything about Japanese culture, they really overthink things, and I'm saying this in a very positive way, overthink things in a way to really get to what do you need, what don't you need, and get the stuff that you need to be perfect, okay? So that's why this stuff looks the way it does, all right? This is not like any other rod you've probably held. The folks that did come up here and you know, picked it up, it's incredibly light. I mean, this whole setup here, the rod is about 4 ounces, maybe 3.5, and the reel is 15, so under 1.5 pounds for a whole setup, all right, which is extraordinarily light. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all of the components of this first. I'm going to explain why it's set up the way it is. Just really, I want to give you the why of everything, because there's not too many sources where you can figure out exactly why these things are all set up the way they are. So we'll start at the bottom of the rod. So first thing you notice is that you have this really exposed blank here. A lot of exposed blank. Butt section is very small grip, okay? Why is that? Well, the reason number one is it's all about listening, okay? When I say listening, I don't mean really with your ears. I mean really paying attention to what's happening to that jig in the water column. By having a exposed blank here, it's always on your arm, and you can basically feel if a fish is sniffing your jig in the water, okay? You know exactly where that thing is. You're getting every single piece of feedback through the vibration of the line, through the rod, and it's kept very close to your body. All right, I'm going to go into the technique in a bit, but you'll notice that when I hold this rod, I'm always holding it under my forearm when I'm jigging. We'll go through the technique, like I said, and I'll explain why that's important, but right now we're just working with the actual tackle itself. Why is this butt end here have a little knob on it? Well, when you do fight the fish and you actually get hooked up, it goes under your arm like this for the fight. So this rod is really a one-trick pony. It's basically designed to work the jig in the water. All right, it's just designed to impart an action on the jig. It's not really designed to be a primary tool to fight the fish. So when you do hook up and that rod is here under your arm or in your armpit, this stops it from sliding out. Okay, because most of the time you're going to be pointing and cranking when you hook up with the fish. You're just letting the reel do the work, point and crank at the fish, no rush. Don't have to worry about trying to force this thing off the bottom. All right. Moving up, we have a reel seat that is extraordinarily small with almost no foregrip, okay? So what does that tell us? First thing is it's shaving weight. The second thing is, like I said before, not a tool to fight the fish. So this is not a lift and pump style, okay? You don't need to have a big foregrip on here. Some people like it. I find that it's a little cumbersome. Some folks are kind of Americanizing this stuff now, where having a longer foregrip so you can actually place it on the rail a little bit. I don't know if I'd necessarily recommend that for most rods, but it's something that's out there. But you'll always notice that it's a conventional reel seat, okay? Any slow pitch rod worth its salt is going to be conventional. And the reason why, we'll go over it in a little bit when we talk about the reels, but there's almost always going to be a conventional reel seat. Part of it has to do with what I said before, not a tool to fight the fish. In order for you to gain line on spinning tackle, you have to lift and pump, right? Lift up, spin down, lift up, spin down. This you can just point and crank. Again, we'll talk about the reel selection in a little bit. As we go down here, we'll notice one thing. If you guys can see, because these are pretty small, and I'll try to get these on the camera there, like that, or like that for you guys. Micro guides, okay? Micro guides on these. These guides are actually bigger than the guides that they first came out with on these rods. Right? So this, you look at these and you're like, oh my god, how am I getting my line through there? Well, again, the reason why is you're always listening. You want that line really close to the blank. You want to get that sensitivity. You want to be able to feel what's happening with the jig in the water. So by having that line close to your blank, and again, we'll go through this in a second, but you're just listening and paying attention to what's going on. You'll also notice with these guides, they're spiral wrapped. So they start here and they wrap down towards the left. Okay, this is a right-handed reel. So why do we have spiral guides? There's three reasons. First reason, sorry about that. First reason is we want to keep the line off the blank, right? So by having spiral guides, it keeps the line off the blank completely. You don't have to worry about anything rubbing. Even though I've never noticed any problems when the line does hit the blank, it's just good to not have any friction points if you don't have to. The second thing is when you're fighting a fish, right? So if you're fighting a fish, big fish, and you're cranking on this side here on the right, naturally it's going to push to this side. By having the guide spiral that way, kind of naturally evens it out. Okay? And the other reason, the last reason, is because when you're jigging, a lot of times you get slack, right? So by having the guides on the bottom, the line will just slide right off the top of the rod. Less foul ups. You won't have to worry about getting tip wrapped or snapping your tip off because you're tip wrapped on the rod. It's a lot less foul ups on the rod. Okay. Now, conversely, this rod here, I'll show you. This is an Innovate. This is what's called a long fall rod. You notice that this is conventionally wrapped, right? But what we did here is we have. Someone didn't silence their phone. We have our guides are kind of at a 45-degree angle there. You can see these are Fuji LBD guides. They're the Super Duty guides. So they're really robust. They can, even though they're small, they're still very strong. But being at that angle there, the line still slides off. The benefit is if you do have a big fish on, this underneath, if you are pinned against the boat for whatever reason, your guides aren't getting hit on the boat. Okay. Also, it's more it's beneficial for people who are lefty anglers because as a manufacturer, you have to kind of pick your battles in terms of whether you go right or left with your spiral. Most anglers in the United States are right-handed anglers. That's why most of the rods for spiral go to the left, as opposed to the other side for a left-handed angler. So, the rod itself is usually between 6'3" and 6'10". That's kind of a pure slow pitch rod length. The longer ones, anything 6'6" and above is kind of a hybrid length where you're able to do kind of long fall presentations. It's better if you're under a canopied boat. And what I mean by canopy is having, a roof like that where if it's real close to you or if it's a little bit further down with T-top, you can still get a better action, with the rod by being a little bit longer. These here, the Innovate, like I talked about before, long fall rod, these are designed for bigger boats, right? And for basically a lift and fall technique. So you're lifting up, getting the rod, the jig to pitch, and falls down very far. Okay. These are designed to put more heat on the fish. They are all two-piece rods, so they break down. They can travel pretty easily. You'll find that a lot of these rods are two-piece rods. There's nothing wrong with two-piece rods. They've definitely come a long way from the past in terms of usage strength. They don't break. It's not. There's no issues with that anymore with the technology on the rods. So Now we've gone through the rods. Oh, last thing, really high carbon content on these things. Very elastic rods, very springy. You know, what you're looking for ideally is a very slow, even unload in the rod. You're not looking for something that snaps back quickly, because what happens is you lose the jig in the water column. You don't actually have control over what's happening with your jig. So that's why you want a very slow, even unload. You know exactly where that jig is in the water, and you know exactly what that jig is doing. Let's talk about the reels for a second. So I mentioned before that you use conventional tackle. There's a couple of reasons for that. The primary reason is you have a lot more control with a conventional reel over a spinning reel. You're on the bottom a lot, so you're always checking the bottom, always checking the bottom, always checking the bottom. Sometimes with the spinning reel, it's kind of hard to figure out if you're on the bottom or not, because you have slack, you don't know what's going on. But also, the issue is staying vertical in the water. That's a theme that you always want to have with slow pitch. The more vertical your presentation is, the better action you're going to have on the jig, the more hookups you're going to get. So here in Florida, we're fishing from drifting boats a lot, right? So you have to pitch up current sometimes so that you kind of time your drift. So you're vertical for a bit, reel up, repeat. In order to get your jig down faster in the water, it doesn't at first make sense, but when you think about it, it does. Put a little bit of tension on the spool. By putting tension on the spool, it'll keep your jig in a vertical position. And a vertical position, it'll fall super quickly. On a spinning reel, you can't do that. You can't apply that same pressure to the spool. So by not being able to put that pressure on the spool, that jig is kind of fluttering wildly through the water column all the way down. And if you're on a drifting boat, the longer it takes to get to the bottom, the more scoped out you're going to be. So that's why you fish primarily with conventional tackle over spinning tackle. It's just a better, more precise way to do it. So let's talk about the characteristics of a reel in general for what you're looking for. So conventional reel, I personally like a narrow spool. This reel here, this is an Accurate 500N Valiant. It has a narrow spool on it. This one holds about 500 yards of 30-pound braid or 700 yards of 14-pound braid. Those are kind of the two weights that I generally use. In terms of the drag output, this one puts out about 30 pounds of drag. The important thing is really the effective drag. Usually you're fishing between 12 and 15 pounds of drag, give or take, on your reel. Again, your reel is doing most of the work for you. So that's why it's important to have very smooth drag with your reel, whatever reel you choose to go with. I personally prefer a handle length on this reel of about 95 to 100 millimeters, hole to hole measurement. So this is a little bit longer. Accurate just came out with this reel here, which is specifically designed for slow pitch. So what they've done is they've removed the clicker from the reel, because you don't need a clicker for jigging. It's just one more place where water can get in there. It's one more place where the line can kind of get latched on when you're fishing. So they removed that. This one happens to be a 2-speed. They went with that 100 millimeter give or take handle, and they have this new T handle on here as an upgrade to the extreme power handle that they have on here. Much more easy to reel in deep water, okay, when you have that T handle. And if you're fishing this type of jigs a lot, you're gonna probably push out to deeper and deeper water, and that T handle is gonna make a bit of difference. What you're looking for in terms of retrieve, meaning handle turn, like per crank, anywhere between 38 and 45, 46 inches per crank. Usually that's pretty adequate. Now, it's not that that's some magic number that you're just kind of pulling out of the air. The reason why it's important is to get the slack out of your line quick once your jig hits the bottom. Okay, gets the slack out of your line quick and allows you to quickly start, getting into your rhythm with pitching the jig. So you know that each one of these handle turns on this reel, when you're fishing it, 1, 2, 3, each one's going to be about 3 feet, give or take. So going back to what I said in the beginning about this being kind of a listening game, you know exactly where your jig is in the water at all times, because you're always counting your handle turns, or at least you should be. Okay, so I know if I have, oops,
Good catch.
glove save and a view.
Not his first time.
I'm not used to being double mic'd up, guys. But in any event, so if you are fishing, you're marking fish on the sounder, say 18 feet off the bottom, right? Well, I know that once that jig hits the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm getting real close to where that fish is. Now I start pitching, right? And I basically put that jig right in front of the fish's face. So that definitely makes a difference. Otherwise, of shallow versus deep water reels. You know, I've fished from, in terms of depths, you know, jigged in 40, 50 feet of water. Deepest I've jigged is 1,500 feet of water. You know, on the bottom, I've currently, I think I'm over 80 species now on jigs. So I've caught just about everything out there that you can catch. But as you push deeper and deeper into the water, your reel is going to change a little bit, right? You're going to usually still use that narrow spool reel, maybe a higher reel, maybe like a 600 NN, or some other companies have some larger capacity reels that'll really let you fish those deeper waters, explore deeper stuff, catch golden tiles, catch things that you really never even thought of before catching on jigs. And it's really cool to watch yourself progress to the different species. But let's talk about the line. So I mentioned that this one here holds about 500 yards of 30-pound braid. You know, whatever 30-pound braid you feel comfortable with is usually more than adequate for this type of fishing. I personally like Yozuri Super Braid. I find that line is really strong. But really what's important is that we test these products, right? We test these products and we test them for line diameter, we test them for breaking strength in a straight pull, test them dry, test them wet, test them with different types of knots being line-to-line connections, okay? So we're going to go through all that stuff right now. So there's 3 ways that you can measure line. There's the IGFA method, which is 12-pound test, right? Breaks at 12 pounds, has to break at 12 pounds. There's a US method that does it, which doesn't mean anything for anyone other than manufacturers across their own lines, which is, hey, I made 30-pound braid. All right, well, how does your 30-pound suffix relate to your 30-pound Power Pro to your 30-pound Yozuri? The only thing that you know is that the 30-pound Yozuri should be thinner than the 50-pound Yozuri, but you don't know exactly how much. And it can vary wildly across different brands. And then there's the PE method. Okay, so PE stands for polyethylene. That's the type of material that these are made out of. The line is made out of, braided line. No stretch to it at all. Again, going back to that sensitivity. But the PE system was developed in Asia. That's developed for line diameter. So now you know how much line is going to go on your reel. Okay, very important to know how much line you can have on there, because you want to have as much capacity on that reel as possible to keep your handle turns consistent. Okay, the further you get down in the spool, the more distance you lose in your crank, and also the higher drag output you have. Okay, so got a couple people looking at me like I have 6 heads. We'll go through this one right now. The further down you go, let's say each handle turn is this one's a 6-to-1 ratio, right? So one handle turn like that, this spool turns 6 times. The further down I am on this spool, if I turn one handle, it's going to be a smaller distance that jig is traveling in the water. So that 45 inches that I told you before is on a full spool. If I'm down to half a spool on this thing, well, now I have half the distance that I'm going. Okay, it's not going to be quite the same in terms of how much line I'm getting back on that retrieve. So by using a higher reel, I can maintain that same inches per crank in deeper water. So that's something to think about when you're moving into deeper water. It's as you get more technical with it, and you can get as technical as you like, it becomes much more of a thinking game, okay, in terms of the mechanics of it. All right. So we talked about the braided material is very important that you fish with braid, not with mono, because you need to have that no stretch line. It gives you a very good response. Line-to-line connections. I'm fishing fluorocarbon here. This is a 50-pound leader. I generally fish 50-pound for almost every application. Very rarely I'll bump it up to 60 if I think I'm going to be in some real big stuff, but for the most part I do it at 50. Small guides, micro guides. Line-to-line connections have to be thin. So on this one, it'll be very difficult to see, but I'm going to try to hold it here in the light against my chest a little bit. Can you see this connection right here? It's almost impossible to see probably from distance, but it's the thinnest possible line-to-line connection that you can get. This is called a PR knot, or a page Rankin knot. Okay. So this knot requires a PR bobbin to tie. You may have seen people do it online where they've got, it looks like a fly tie-in bobbin, and they're kind of spinning the line, you know, all the way down. What that is if you think about that old thing when you're a kid, those the Chinese finger cuff, the harder you pull apart, the tighter it gets on you. It's the same principle. So really it's a knotless knot. You kind of wind down real slow and then flip it over how a bimini turns over and get real tight all the way down and finish it off with 1/2 inches. But what that allows you to do is to have almost no connection here. So it passes through these guides seamlessly, which is super important because these things are expensive and not very big. So you really need to work on your line-to-line connections. Big, bulky connections are not going to work for you. All right. Going back to the line in terms of what I use or what we've tested, keep in mind that just because something says that it's 30-pound line doesn't necessarily mean that's where it breaks at. Okay. The 30-pound line that we've tested breaks at 51 pounds. I drop down to a 14-pound line when I fish real deep. That breaks at 41 pounds. The reel on its best day puts out 30. You're going to be fine in a straight pull. Okay, that's why I'm not too particularly worried about fishing that light of a line, because it really is quite strong. If anybody can hold 30 pounds of drag for any amount of time, I'll give you $100. It's pretty substantial. You know, I've seen people in fighting harnesses, stand-up harnesses, that have a hard time with 30 pounds. But let's talk about our terminal connections now, because we're kind of getting that in. Uh-oh, we have a question.
Back to the reel.
Huh?
Why do we fish longer arms, or why do we modify our arms over the stock arm that we get from the manufacturer?
Good question. So Jeff's question, in case you couldn't hear it, was why do we modify the arms, or why do we prefer to have a longer arm on our reels? Really, it's torque. You want to be able to maximize the amount of power that you're going to get on this fish, especially if you're in deep water. It really lets you crank down on these fish. I know that Jeff, he's probably caught the biggest black grouper I've ever seen in some really deep water. I think it was 90, right? 84, was it? 72. I thought it was 90, but anyway, 72. That's a pretty damn good fish. That's a pretty good black. You know, I mean, from what I've seen, it was a big black. And he was fishing in really deep water. He was fishing, if memory serves, about 600 feet of water in Pulley Ridge. He was using Seafloor Control Arc 260 gram jig, if I remember correct. Yeah. It was the gold and the glow on the back. The pearl glow on the back, right? So blacks have no business being in 600 feet of water. But the point of the story is that Jeff had a Shimano Torsa with a really long handle on it. And I remember when he came back from that trip, and he specifically said, if I didn't have that longer handle, there was no way I would have gained ground on that fish. And he was really able to crank down on that thing as it was coming up because he had that longer handle. So that's why we like longer arms on these reels. I mean, you're really putting everything onto this thing to crank. And if you're only using the reel to fight the fish, you want to have every advantage that you possibly can. So that's why I like the longer handles. That's why Patriot came out with a longer handle on this new slow pitch dedicated reel that they have. We're talking about terminal connections, or we're going that way. So at the end here of your fluoro leader, and people ask me how long of a leader do I use a very scientific 4 wingspans. So what's that, 15 feet give or take of leader? It's no special amount. It just gives me enough where I can retie several times if you get cut off or have to retie for whatever reason. It's, you know, you can use shorter if you want. The shorter the leader that you use, the better it probably is. But 15 feet is sufficient. What's that?
How short is it when you replace it?
Usually for me is when, if I'm, see how I kind of have the this kind of hanging here. If I see that my PR knot is there when my my tag into my line here is kind of by my reel, so I know I only got maybe, what's this, 8 feet total, I'm gonna probably change it out right then. Or if I hook up with a bunch of fairly big fish in a row and it's gotten stretched a bunch, then you probably should change it too, because it does take a beating, and being stretched for extended periods of time does put some wear onto it. So, a couple ways that you can tie off your fluoro. I personally prefer a ball bearing swivel. Okay, other people prefer a solid ring. Either way you tie it, it's going to be going to this solid ring here on top of your ball bearing swivel, or directly to a solid ring. The reason why this is important to have this little intermediary step before you get to your jig, so you're not tying directly to your jig, is that it allows you to swap out your jig quickly. Okay, so if you have ball bearing swivel, and I have my jig here, the best thing in the world is going to be your split ring pliers. It's going to be your best friend. So very quickly, you just find the end of your your split ring there, and quickly tie on your jig. You can get one jig on, one jig off, very easy, and it's simple. So whether it's a solid ring or the swivel, either way, it helps you interchange your jigs pretty quickly. I personally prefer the ball bearing swivel because I think when you have a large fish and it's coming up in the water and its mouth is open and it's spinning, this allows the jig to spin independently of your line, so you don't get a lot of line twists on the way up. I think that is more beneficial to you than having the straight to a solid ring. Some people think that the action is a little bit better with a solid ring, but I have not had any issues with action using a ball bearing swivel.
Hey Benny, just to confirm,
yeah,
you have the swivel, but you also have the hook set attached to that, so you don't have to change out that extra hook set.
Correct.
A lot of guys aren't familiar with that.
Right. Yeah, we're talking about that in a second. So with respect to how you're tying your line to your terminal connection to your jig, again, the proper way to do that is to have this intermediary split ring here. So you notice that my solid ring to my split ring to my jig. My split ring is the connection between my terminal tackle and my jig itself. Off of my split ring, I'm having my assist hooks. Okay, we'll talk about the different types of assist hooks in a little bit, but the reason why that's important is because these are in the fish's mouth. This is independent. Doesn't matter. It can spin all it wants. It's not going to affect the jig or be able to use a tool to wedge out of the fish's mouth. It's just going to be stuck in there. Okay. Placement of these hooks. It's important that these hooks on top are always on the flat side of the jig. Okay. Because notice that these jigs are asymmetrical. Every single slow pitch jig you find is going to be asymmetrical. One side's going to be a little bit more bulbous, one side's going to be flat usually. All right. You want it to be on the flat side of the jig because as this jig falls in the water, these are going to be kind of hanging up here, and they're not going to be influencing your line or get connected to anything and foul you up along the way. All right. Another thing that's important with your hook placement is that your hooks don't overlap in the middle. So this is a FCL Lavo jig. You notice got two sets of assist hooks on here. They will never, ever, ever overlap in the center. They will get close, but they will never overlap. The reason why is you don't want these hooks to interlock, and you don't want them to foul up in the water. It really sucks when you're 600 feet of water and your jig fouls up, and you now you think you have a small fish on, you got to reel all the way back up and reset. Assist hooks. There's two different ways you can do it. Well, three really. I prefer these two ways. You can either fish with these dual assist hook style, or you can fish with this single assist hook style. I personally prefer the dual assist in pretty much everything up to about 400 feet of water. All right, once I get over 400 feet of water, then I start switching over to the single assist hooks. Why do we use two assist hooks on top and two assist hooks on the bottom? All right, well, the first reason is fish generally attack from the head. Okay, if you've ever tried to pick a fish up backwards, you know you're going to get spined. Most of the time when fish eat something, they eat something head first. So as this jig is moving in the water, it's going to slash this way or go this way, and depending on which way it's moving is how the fish is going to attack it. So if it's going this way, they're going to hit here. If it's moving this way, they're going to hit here on the jig. And then once it's hooked, it'll move, it'll shake its head. The other hooks will usually get embedded in the fish at some point. All right, that allows you to use thinner gauge hooks, which have better penetration power. You see that these have a very, very sharp, very slow tapering point on them. Okay, these get very good penetration into fish's mouths. These things are not hook setting machines. They're, again, tools to work the jig. These fish are basically going to set the hook themselves. You're just going to reel out the slack and kind of give it a little, like a strike, and to set the hook. These hooks here are Gamakatsu hooks. These are 510 assist hooks, number 3 up. They have barbs on the outside. So if you're fishing with them and they do catch your leader a little bit, they'll slide off, which I think is pretty beneficial. I've never had one of them fail. I've been using them for years. I love the hooks personally. I think you'll probably like them too. The other way that you can rig is when I fish in deep water, which I said before, like if you're going 400 and over, I like switching over to single hooks. These are also Gamakatsu hooks. They're kind of a modified tuna blade, so you notice that they're still, these are about 7/0s, I think. It's not too much bigger than the 3/0s, but still won't touch in the middle. Really good penetrating power, really thin tapered hook, and they hold very well. I just like having single hooks, so I feel like even though your chances of foul ups are pretty small with these, sorry about this wind, guys, the chances of foul ups are even less with having single hooks. And I tried them out pretty extensively in Pulley Ridge a couple weeks ago, and they did very, very well. I was actually very impressed by having only those hooks. Let me take this jig off for a second.
Any reason why you don't like using the feathers on the hooks?
Use what?
The feathers or the...
Oh, feathers or like other jewelry?
Stuff? Yeah.
Okay. So the question was, is there any reason why I don't like having kind of extras on my assist hooks? Like, so you'll see some assist hooks, they'll have, you know, little kind of feathers or little piece that looks like tinsel on there to, you know, for the other flash that people think is gonna somehow attract a fish. This is how I think about it. You've got a jig that doesn't look like a fish, that doesn't smell like a fish, that's got 4 hooks flying around. I refuse to think that a piece of tinfoil hanging off of this thing is going to increase the strike. I don't think that's really happening. But I think the more important thing is the more stuff that you have on your hooks, like squid skirts or tying on that extra stuff, the more resistance you're going to have in the water for that jig fall. Okay, so as it's going to fall slower, and it's going to get you away from being in that vertical presentation where you want to be. All right, so I like personally having no, just kind of naked hooks like this. I don't think that there's anything, less attractive to the fish for, this thing sliding through the water versus something that has little squids hanging on it. I'll never tip a jig. I won't put actual pieces of squid on it. Some people like that. It is very effective, but I'm kind of a purist in that sense. And also, again, I don't like having that extra weight or kind of parachuting on my hooks.
So that explains the TN knot with the chain knot.
Yeah.
Is that a what knot is that?
Okay, so question was about the knot to this terminal connection on the swivel here. He mentioned a TN knot. So if you look on YouTube, you can see what's called a TN or a AG chain knot. It's basically a series of overhand knots that's about that long. It's 100% if you tie it correctly. It just takes a really long time to tie, and I haven't noticed any real increase in the benefit of using that versus just tying a simple Palomar. My whole thing is I want to tie a knot that I'm comfortable with, that I know it's going to do. I want to tie obviously on a boat at night in the rain that is I'm comfortable with. I personally tie a Palomar. You can tie whatever you like. If the AG chain or TN knot is your thing, by all means go for it. But for me, I'm cool with something a little more simple.
You got affect the action of the jig?
I don't think it affects the action of the jig.
High noise, nothing?
No. To be honest with you, I haven't fished it enough to even formulate a decent idea on that, but I don't think it does. Just kind of seeing people next to me who have fished, it doesn't seem to affect them at all. Okay, so we've got our jigs, we've got our hooks, we talk about our rods, talk about the line, the leader, the reels, the retrieve. Let's talk about the jigs. Okay, so inevitably, anytime I give one of these seminars, and I've given a lot of them, people will ask me, what's my favorite color? What's the best jig for insert name of species here? And then, where do I buy jigs? So, or what would I recommend to somebody starting out in terms of jigs? So, in case you guys haven't seen, these jigs are not cheap for the most part. You've got something like this one here. This is an FCL Labo. This is a $45 jig. This is a seafloor control. It's another $40 jig. It's an NLO. This is about 28 bucks. These are available at Bass Pro Shops now, FYI. And then this is a Jig Pro jig. These actually are really great jigs, by the way. These are priced a little more economically, under 20, which is good. But the point of the matter is, they're expensive, and there's a lot of toothy critters. Toothy critters take jigs, which is what they do, and they seem to take the expensive ones more than they take the cheap ones. I don't know why, but it just kind of seems like that's always how it works out. Yeah, they just really want to sock it to you. So, in any event, the importance with jigs is that each jig has different hydrodynamic properties, which is just a fancy way of saying they fall differently in the water. Okay, so by knowing how these jigs fall, by being able to know how every single jig in your bag falls, you're going to be able to key into the conditions of the day. Can you use one jig and get away with it and fish okay? Yes, absolutely, 100% you can. However, you are going to have better opportunities to catch more and better fish if you know how these things work and you pair them to your conditions. So, the question that I always get, what jig would I recommend to someone who's just starting out? Gold hammered diamond jig, or silver hammered diamond jig, whatever one it is. Hammered diamond jigs. They work, they've been around forever. As I say before, they are like the Toyota Camry or the Honda Accord of jigging. They work, they're relatively inexpensive, and it gives you an idea of the action of the rod and what you're doing, the action of the jig in the water, and it lets you figure out what the heck you're doing first before you drop 40 bucks on a jig that you don't know what you don't know, and you still won't be able to really manipulate it how you should. Okay, build up to these things. They have their place. They definitely do. I always say that the difference between an average jig fisherman and a good one is jig selection, and really being able to match it to the key conditions of the day. Meaning, you want it to be vertical. You want it to have the right action for the fish. You want to be keyed into what they're doing, and then later on you start worrying about the insignificant things like color, things like that. So, color. People always ask me, "What's my favorite color jig?" I don't know. I tend to fish silvers, pinks, golds, oranges, glow, and then jigs that kind of look like other fish. Those are kind of my go-to colors. I don't think that it's necessarily one color is better than the other. I don't think that a fish is going to look at it in the water and go, oh, well, that one's green, so I'm definitely not biting that one. I've caught every kind of fish in every different type of color jig. It just seems to me, very gross science, but the greens and the blues tend to not do as well in my experience for whatever reason here. Flip that to Southeast Asia and Australia, greens are like the #1 color over there. So go figure. I don't know really what rhyme or reason it is. What I have figured out though, and what seems to be the case, is that things that reflect UV light tend to get hit more than things that don't reflect UV light. And you also have to remember that what we see up here is not what the fish see in the bottom. Visible light spectrum, as you go down in the water column, changes. Reds disappear first. Reds turn to almost blacks. Then you go down, 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 where the white is the last color to go. Okay. Now, you can look at what these fish are doing. I mentioned this before when we were talking earlier. Deep water fish, it's almost pitch black down there. If you're fishing in 600-800 feet of water, these fish still have eyes, so they're seeing something, right? There's not a lot of light, so maybe they're using whatever light is available to them. But I feel like that UV is something that they might see. Something in a different spectrum than what we see, but it seems to me that you get more strikes when you use something that has a UV reflective pattern on it. Okay? Not necessarily glow, but something that you shine a black light on and the thing will light up. Alright, so now we're into technique. So what is the proper technique for these rods? As I mentioned before, having that rod under your forearm. I've been working on these forearms since I'm about 14, 15 years old, so we've got some pretty good base there. It's sometimes, at first, it's very hard. For my first 2 years of doing this, way back when, I fished a lot with it under my arm because it was comfortable and it's what I knew, right? Because when you speed jig, it's under your arm and you're ripping that thing to the water column like this, right? This is a lot different. By having the rod under your forearm here, you're using this essentially as a lever, right? This is your fulcrum point. So by putting in much less effort, but just pressing down on this portion here, you're loading the rod with the weight of the jig, okay? When I mentioned before about these rods, they have excellent recoil, very slow, even unload on the recoil, right? So you're using the rod and the technology of the rod to pitch the jig in the water, okay? When a fish is going to strike this, I mentioned before this is a reaction strike, but I think the pitch of that jig, once it comes off on the dart, one way or another, that catches the fish's attention, then he sees it fall, and they go and get it, okay? But you're always going to have that rod under here while you're pitching the jig. So, moving the jig in the water column, you're not reeling on the way down, you're reeling on the way up. You don't want to reel down. Again, these have a very high retrieve to get that slack out of your line. You don't want to take the slack out while you're jigging because you want to have that jig in free fall to do whatever the heck that particular jig does. Okay. Once you do hook up though, you go from under that forearm to under here, under your armpit. And again, you have that butt section that stops it from sliding out, and you're basically pointing and cranking. I mean, you can put a little bit of heat on these rods. There's some companies now that have rods that you can, I mean, probably seen the videos, the pump like a man, all that stuff with hardy rise and the pulling on it. It has its place. But if you're using a 3/0 hook or a small hook like that and you want to put 25 pounds of drag on a fish and pull back like this, that's all well and good, but you're going to rip the hook out of the fish's mouth. Okay? By pointing at the fish, the way I liken it is kind of like if you're walking a dog. Right? You're walking a dog, your dog sees a squirrel across the street, your dog wants to go get that squirrel. He's pulling, right? But if you kind of gently guide him, he'll get out of it and he'll come with you a lot easier. Same thing what I find with fish. After that initial kind of violent strike, because it's always a violent strike, you find, what I found is that when you're not putting that much pressure on the fish, they tend to be more cooperative as they come up. I mean, granted, you're going to have certain fish that are going to be super angry no matter what you do, but this is not going to be a point, you know, a lift and pump. You're not going to pin this thing in your hip there and really lift and reel down and do all this stuff. You don't have to do that. You got better results, more efficient results, and even if I do fish bait, I have really gotten away from that technique of lifting and pumping on a fish. Now again, going back to the science of it, how far do you think this distance is? How far?
Well, measure-wise, probably 3 foot.
3 feet. How far is this?
Close to 3 feet.
About 3 feet, right? So it's the equivalent of one of these versus this. And all you're doing with this is putting a bigger hole in the fish's mouth and giving it more opportunity to come out, right? So it's a much more efficient fight when you point at the fish and you just kind of let him take line. You want to take line, go ahead. Just point and crank, point and crank, point and crank, get him up to the boat. Once that fish is up onto the water and the gap is in the fish or the net, really important to put that reel in free spool. Keep your hand on the thumb or thumb on the line right here so you can kind of manage at the line coming out. The last thing that you want to do, have that reel locked up, and all of a sudden the tip is tips. You can just see it happening, and then pop, you snap a tip off. You don't want to do that. So just be mindful that these rods are, you know, even though they're extraordinarily strong and they're very precise tools, they are also fragile. So be careful with your tips on them. Make sure you get that fish into the boat. Then, okay, now we can go ahead and manage whatever's going on there. Kind of gone through everything. I know it's a lot of information. It's a big, you know, sorry, motorcycles. And we're back. It's a lot of information I downloaded on you. There's so much to this, and the more you do it, the more you'll realize that there's a lot to it. Okay, it's very difficult to explain to people without being on the water, the technique, everything that goes into it, and that's really part of the fun, is the learning aspect of it. Is you're learning something that's entirely different. I've had a million people tell me, "Oh, I know how to fish." Cool. I'm not doubting that, but you might not know how to do this, right? So you really have to have an open mind. Take what you know, kind of put it in the back of your head. Keep going with a new technique. Realize that it's different. Realize that it's a learning experience. Take it all in. Think you'll have fun. I know I do. And it's not the answer to everything, but it's pretty damn good. You know, you can put a lot of fish on the boat, especially when they're really keyed into jigs. It takes it also. You know, it's just really, really fun. So I guess I'll kind of open it up to questions. I know a lot of folks have questions. He's got one. All right.
If a long skinny jig works better 90% of the time, especially out front in the current, why use a short fat one sometimes?
Okay. The question is, if a long skinny jig works better 90% of the time, then why use a short fat one? And the answer would be, in that 10% of the time, use it. There you go. So it's pretty simple.
No, I mean, I push myself all the time. Yeah. I always use a shorter, fatter one. People are like, why? I'm like, I don't know why.
Yeah. So what I find with jigs in terms of the size and shape of them is a lot of times fish are keyed into different profiles. Okay. So a lot of times that's, again, like any other thing, match the hatch. People have said that forever. For whatever reason, it doesn't seem necessarily that they're like it's the end all be all for them. Okay. So what I look for in a jig, the first thing I look for is I want to keep the jig vertical in the water. So look at what my conditions are. Here, the reason why longer, skinnier jigs tend to do better is because we tend to have more current. So you can fish it longer in the strike zone, right? But that's where the manipulation comes into play. So if I know that, for instance, this jig, right, this 260 gram jig in 200 or 300 feet of water and a knot and a half of current is going to get me down just fine, and it's going to keep me vertical in the water. And let's say something like this, which is maybe a little bit slower to fall because it has a wider profile, but still about the same length. I know that I have to bump this jig up significantly in weight to get the same performance out of it. But that's part of the manipulation that you're doing, right? You're trying to figure out, number one, what weight is going to keep me vertical. Number two, what action of that jig are the fish keyed into. Sometimes they're keyed into things that kind of have a very, what I call hang time. You know, when you pitch that jig and it just goes limp and you feel like it's almost like hovering, right? Those tend to be the wider jigs. And then you have these more narrow jigs that kind of slash the water a little bit more, you know, kind of valley length, right? It really is just kind of figuring out what they're keyed into that day. So if they're 90% of the time you're working with long jigs, keep going, you know, trip.
So for this trip that we're doing on this boat, talk a little bit about how you would fish off the side of the boat, or how we're going to be drifting, or maybe techniques, maybe scope of the line and how far do you let it scope out before you pull it back up, maybe some of that stuff just related to the trip.
Sure. All right, so several questions related specifically to this boat, this trip, or I'll equate it to other larger boats, basically head boat style fishing. So it's going to depend on a couple of things. The first thing is going to be how deep we're fishing. All right. The second thing is going to be what our conditions are. Are we wind drift? Are we current drift? Do we have multiple layer current? Do we have flat on top, multiple current ripping on the bottom? We're figuring out, first of all, usually what I like to do is just make one drop. I'll take a jig that I know, how it performs in a bunch of different conditions, very neutral jig, drop it down and see what it does. And then from there, expand off of that. So for staying vertical on a boat like this, one of the best ways is if you're towards the stern or the bow to pitch up current. If you're kind of drifting broadside like this, if you're drifting stern to bow, you can pitch up towards the bow wherever the boat is drifting in that direction. And then what that'll happen is it'll go out to a certain point, it'll drift down, and as the boat comes over, you're vertical, right? So you keep your vertical position as much as possible. There's no substitute for reeling up. You're going to be doing that a whole hell of a lot. That's just what it is. Okay, cost of doing business. But if you're on a boat like this, that's going to be really helpful for so that's going to be really helpful. Boat like this, longer rods are beneficial. Something like an Innovate here. This is an 8-foot rod. Helps really keep the line away from the boat. Again, fishing lighter line. Braid doesn't break from straight poles usually. It breaks from abrasion. So if this thing is rubbing on the bottom of the boat, you might have a bad time. So that'll be something else I
The leader, you mentioned 30 pounds, 40 pounds for the braid. What about the leader?
I use a 50 pound leader. Yeah, 50 pound fluorocarbon. I personally prefer a really hard fluorocarbon. I use AFCO Psycho Pro fluorocarbon. It's made by Sunline, which is the fluoro that I use before I use the AFCO stuff. I've landed pretty substantial fish with the 50. I really haven't found too many situations where I feel undergunned with 50. I mean, it happens every now and then, but that stuff's pretty strong. It's pretty strong, and usually you're far enough away from the jig, from the fish that you don't have to worry about that fluoro getting abraded. But there are toothy things out there, and sometimes things happen. Another question?
Hey, Benny, they put out a sea anchor to slow the boat down.
Some do.
Capabilities on this boat?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. That would be a question for Ralph. Yeah, and I'm not sure.
That new type of surflon or whatever it's called.
Sorry, what?
Surflon or what is the? It's like it's not a wire, but it's a wire.
Oh, you're talking about that like the flexible braid, or the flexible wire that you can tie knots with.
Yeah.
For purposes of like tying on the jigs so you don't lose jigs. What I find with using that type of stuff, the question is, have I ever used wire on jigs to prevent cutoffs? Yes, I have. but I don't like it. And I almost never do. So the way I look at it is I'm fishing for the bite first. Okay, so when I'm fishing for the bite first, that means I want to have the best action on my jig. What I find is that when you have wire, it decreases the action on the jig. Okay, and when it decreases the action, you get less strikes. So I realize that I'm going to lose more tackle because I'm not going to have that edge protection. If you're fishing in places that aren't very high pressure, where the fish aren't line shy, you know, you're in off of like Puerto Rico. I know they fish with wire a lot on, you know, catch wahoo on jigs all the time. You know, if you're down in Pulley Ridge, you probably will be all right if you fish wire on it. My thing is, what's the benefit that you're going to get, right? You're probably, for the every one wahoo out of 1,000 fish that you are going to catch, you're going to have to bring that bull shark to the boat, right? And that's something that I don't really want to do. So I'll be much more happy to lose the tackle than to deal with the pain of trying to fight a bull shark on one of these things. And the worst part is you're going to land it. That's the worst part. You know, so it's you're praying, please break off, and you won't. So
you're okay with losing the $30 jig?
It's the cost of doing business. The question was, am I okay with losing a $30 jig? I mean, in my heart of hearts, no. But what are you gonna do? Right? Yeah, that's kind of the cost of business.
It's way cheaper than it doesn't goggle eyes every day.
That's another thing. People are going, you know, tournament fishing. They're buying gogs for $10 a piece. You only get one shot on those, right? At least I have the opportunity to catch a few fish on these things before they go. They usually don't. They're not too hardy, or someone's gonna take them out of your bait pen, you know, behind your house. Any other questions on here?
Nice. Have you used the new Accurate?
Have I used the slow pitch one? No, I haven't used it yet. It literally just came out this week.
No,
no, I haven't fished it. I was just messing around with them before. I do like the length of the handle. I really like the it's a 2-speed. That model is 2-speed. They come in single speed and 2-speed. But that handle in there is a lot more comfortable for deep water.
Hey Benny, quick question. Just going back to the line.
Sure.
So I'm noticing that there's a huge difference in the diameter of the line, even on the same pound test that's advertised on the spools. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Across different manufacturers?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so I touched on it. Yeah, I touched on it a little bit before. Yeah, so
like some are 0.23 and some are 0.29 that are the same.
I never ever believe what a manufacturer states for their line, ever, for the diameter. Almost always they will understate the diameter and overstate the breaking strength of it. So what I think is important for people to do is to actually test the lines themselves if they can. There used to be a really great site, Paulus, which is no longer available, but if you're internet savvy, you can still find stuff from it, where he did a breakdown of basically every major manufacturer's line and got the breaking strength, the actual diameter of it, so you can figure out how big it is. The Yozuri measures, the 30-pound measures out to about 0.31 millimeters in diameter. The Fireline is about 0.28 millimeters in diameter. That little bit of difference on a 500N is the difference between 500 and 700 yards on your rig.
But also, if you're dropping deep, it's a huge difference.
Huge difference.
A lot of guys don't think about the drag of your line, but it's a huge difference.
Yeah.
The diameter of your line, if you're going to 600 feet, it's two different.
It's a very noticeable difference. I mean, recent trip to Pulley Ridge, we were fishing between 600 and 800 feet. I was using 14-pound line, and I was staying much more vertical than the folks that were using 30 or 40-pound line.
And what's your breaking point on that 14?
41 pounds
so
on a straight pulley and breaks.
Yeah,
it's not breaking. I mean, I've hooked up to the bottom of that thing and just both thumbs on the spool, holding this thing, and please break, please break. Yeah. Finally, it'll go, but it's super duper strong stuff.
So the tackle that you're using is extremely important, especially if you want to go deeper.
Yeah, 100%.
And if you have a lot of current.
The deeper you go, the more technical it gets. The fishing in 700-800 feet of water with respect to jigs is a hell of a lot more technical in terms of getting up and down. And the fish are a lot more dumb, but the actual getting up and down is hard, right? So the deeper you go, generally speaking, the fish they're going to bite anything that even moves in there, right? So that's cool. So as long as you can get down there, you're all good. The problem is getting down there.
Thick, you might not even hit the bottom.
Right. Especially if you have that 2-layer current, you know, how many times have you been out there and you're like, I should have hit bottom already, and you realize it's so calm out here, but underneath it's just screaming in the other direction.
Now on the opposite side of that, there's a lot of reels coming out that are smaller. They're getting smaller and smaller. Some of them don't have the cranking distance. Now, is that as important if you're less than 200 feet deep?
Not really.
Not really.
Not as much. No. I think anything under 250, it's pretty shallow. You know, a lot of people think it's deep, but it's not. And it's kind of harsh to say, but it's just not.
Right.
It's a lot less important at that lower depth than it is at the higher depths. Right. So you can fish you can get away with heavier line, but again, why even bother? Why if it's existing stuff and you're just you're on a budget and you don't want to spend however much it costs to respool the reel, I get it. I fully understand that. But if you want to have that ability to go out further, why not use the line that's going to get you out further but also perform in shallow water too? There's really no loss in performance in terms of benefit that you gain from using heavier line. So
there's a lot of talk about like micro jigging these days.
Yeah.
So even micro jigging is coming. So smaller setups, lighter line, smaller jigs. It's becoming popular to have separate setups for them too.
It is. The micro jigging is starting. It's starting to get fairly popular in Japan. There's a bunch of folks down in Brazil that are doing it a lot now. Having really good success with it. And they're fishing shallower water, and they're catching really big fish with these little tiny jigs, little 1/0 hooks, live bait hooks on them. It's kind of cool to see. And they're using spinning tackle a lot too, because you're in shallower, so it's not as important to thumb the spool or things like that. Places like South Florida, we probably sell more spinning reels here than anywhere in the country. So people really like spinning stuff. I personally hate it, but a lot of people like it, love it. And if it's for you, if that's what you like to do, by all means, go for it. So, any other questions?
Anybody else?
Anybody else?
So Benny, are you still doing trips where you'll go out with people and for a fee?
Yeah.
Boat?
Yeah, and then it's kind of a weird thing to do, to have somebody go out there and essentially coach you, but in a 4-hour morning, I can probably take off a year or two in their learning curve. By just looking at what you're doing, saying, all right, well, try this. Have you ever thought about this? That's it's a benefit that a lot of people have seen when I do it. Yeah.
So guys, if you guys are trying to learn about different types of jigs, the fall pattern of the jigs, which is, I think, once you get out there and do it a few times, the type of jigs like Benny focused on, jig selection is extremely important. Get 4 guys together, take Benny out with you, and he'll sit there and show you. We'll focus on 3 types of jigs or whatever the case is, and it's a great opportunity to learn from the pioneers in this industry.
Yeah, it's a good opportunity, and I'm local here. I live in Pompano, so I fish out of South Florida, anywhere really.
So that was a good point. The 3.
What's that?
Can take you on a kayak?
Might have to pass. It's the way I look at the ocean is you probably should have an engine. So, these feet are not going to do it. I'm not going to pedal my way in when I see a storm pop up. But good luck.
So you mentioned the three style jigs: wide body, narrow, and hybrid. Is that correct? I think Jeff was.
Well, we were talking before about a longer style jig. So something like this is a 500-gram jig, but a longer, thinner style jig versus a shorter, fatter jig like that. And then the third style was just kind of a traditional, just gold hammer jig. I don't have any of those with me right now.
Gold and silver hammer.
Yeah.
So, but as far as me learning, again, I'm a novice. So wide body, narrow, and then hybrid.
I would say hybrid. So I would say that like a gold hammer jig, a traditional, just a hammer diamond jig is super good. Those things, they work. They're not for every condition. That's the difference. Those things work most of the time. They're going to catch fish. They're going to put fish in the boat, and it doesn't hurt quite as bad to lose.
Gotta have versatility.
Yeah.
I got you. Cool. Thanks.
All right. Yep. So, any other questions?
Benny, I guess there was a question about the sea anchor and stuff.
Yeah.
So we have such a deep draft. We draw 8 feet of water on this boat, where most head boats draw 4.5 or 5. So this thing is not a kite. It's not aluminum. It's not light. It's steel hull. It's a real heavy boat. So definitely in the beginning, we won't have a sea anchor. I don't know if they would honestly make one big enough for this boat. Greg is pushing it with the one he fishes with the length and the weight of his boat. We've got about 40 tons on him. So
That's a substantial season.
Yeah.
So yeah, things of a parachute. How bad?
We would probably need something from NASA.
Yeah. If anybody, if you haven't been down here, for whoever's watching this, wherever you're watching it, this boat is something to look at. I haven't been on any boats like this. Outside of long-range boats in California, I've never seen anything like this here. It's definitely special. So we're really looking forward to fishing this boat. That's for sure.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
All right, guys. Well, thank you for coming. Appreciate it. Hope you learned a little bit.
Before you go, I just want to make one announcement. We have the Jigging tournament that's coming up in February. It's probably going to get pushed into May.
Ooh.
Because there's more fish available for weighing. Season opens May 1st. I just saw that tile fish. There's going to be a season for blue line tiles, which I don't think that's happened before.
Is that what you mean?
So May 1st, I think it's January to May. Is also tile fish are closed down, so I thought they were open all year round before.
It depends, I guess, on the whatever the people.
I know golden tiles always have a season, but the blue lines didn't. So just keep an eye out for the updates on that tournament, and I think it's going to be fun. We're going to have drift boat, kayak, and boat categories, so everybody can fish.
You got the kayak guys are up too.
Yeah.
Ready? All right, guys.
All right, thanks again, guys.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks.
Hold on.
Thank you.
Hold on. That's my buddy Chad Adelman. He's like, dude, he's like, bro, I ain't never seen anything like this.
Alright, get the captain's quarters real quick. Captain's quarters. That's where the captain sleeps. There's the bathroom there. The crewman. Got some state-of-the-art technology right there. You can guide it from out here as well. That's much clearer. The boat. Controls on the left and right side of the boat. Components up there. Alright, we got the kill box. That is a saltwater ice machine. Okay, thank you, dude. And this is a dead bait freezer. Call it dead bait in there. Dead bait walk-in freezer. Going into the galley, we got bathrooms, 2 bathrooms. Got a full kitchen. The chef's gonna be preparing a meal. How you doing, chef? Alright. There's the buffet. Freezer. Got a soft serve ice cone machine. Fountain, dishwasher, food rig. There goes the gallery. Go to the outside.
Find courses, certificates, and degrees on Coursera. Join for free at Coursera.org. Coursera, your course to success.
When we started our business, we were paying like an arm and a leg for the postage. I remember setting up ship station. I think it was just like 1 or 2 clicks. Everything was up and running. I was putting out labels.
Ship station saves us so much time.
Take a sample. Nope. So, you got the gallery, and you got the wall. And this is where the bunk beds are, where we'll be sleeping. Pre-padded. Bathroom showers. Sliding door, lockable. It's about 32 bunk beds here. This is the longest one right here. It's probably going to be the coldest one because the vents are right there, but you can store a lot of stuff back there. Now the bathroom. And there's the end of that. Illegal drugs fly in and out. Could put coolers, but they provide all meals, so no point in really bringing coolers unless you bring in beer. Front of the boat. See a snook or something?